We have our first speaker is John Paul Courtens. And he's a native of the Netherlands. He's a graduate of Wormendorf Agricultural College, specializing in biodynamic farming. He is the founder of Roxbury Farm in Kimberhook, New York. He's one of the founders of Collaborative Regional Alliance for Farmer Training, and the author of the Roxbury Online Crop and Harvest Manuals. In 2018, he and his wife Crystal founded Philia Farm in Johnstown, New York, where they grow crops for seed and vegetable production and garlic, while conducting on-farm research. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic to John Paul, and you have to hold it kind of close.
All right. Well, I'm getting the clicker. Let me get a little bit of sense for who I am speaking with. How many of you grow vegetables? Write a number. And how many strictly go field crops? It's about 50-50. All right, great. Anyway, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we do it in the context of organic farming. How many of you are organic? That's the minority. All right. Nevertheless, I think that some of the things, the lessons that we have learned over, years, do apply. And one question I want to start off with, and you can answer them for me, is actually a question that my soil science teacher asked me many, many years ago. Unfortunately, he didn't give the answer. He said, "You guys figure it out during your career." But he said, like, my observation is that I drive around and I see the organic field crop growers, and they have far less weeds in the field than you organic vegetable farmers. Why is that? Spend a lot less time. Anybody have the answer to that?
Well, we grow crops, shade the ground.
Shade, you said? Thank you. Like that. Cultivate better. Okay. Well, this is a shy audience. It's okay. I'm not going to push it. Let me just say that everything I've learned about tillage, everything I've learned about weed control is from my colleagues who are field crop growers. I've learned very little from my colleagues who are vegetable growers. No offense, guys. No offense. It's just that they just know better what they're doing. And it's not to do with scale, I think, as much as with some other variables that I would like to touch upon and how I have applied that as a vegetable grower. So I've learned from them, and how do I do this? So these are some of the things that I've heard some of those. Crop rotation is number one. They usually have better rotations. Summer bare fallow, seed predation, shade was mentioned, population, and fertility management. Now, first of all, vegetables, growing vegetables is not a rotation. It doesn't help against a lot of things that have to do with plant diseases or insect control, especially when they're local. But for weeds, it's definitely not a great way. And I'll touch upon that later, why not. And seed predation works best if you can take the land out of production. You see some of our field crop growers, they might alternate a couple of years of field crops with sod for 4 years. Well, Brian will touch upon that more about how seed predation works. And then again, the whole thing about shade, right? Vegetables that need light, they need air drainage. And when you think of carrots, they provide very little competition compared to, say, field corn. And then the last one is really actually only recently being talked about. The nitrogen applications that we're using at vegetable growers are excessive at times. And we now know from, especially in the research we're doing on the rolling and crimping, that actually when you plant rye and the nitrogen levels are really high in the fall, is that we see a lot more weeds in the spring popping through the rolled and crimped rye. So we now know to reduce our nitrogen applications, to reduce the weeds that are in your field. So over time, and because I was living with this question with my soil science teacher, I was like, okay, so what am I supposed to do here? And then I met Eric and Ann Ordell in Pennsylvania. They were Live Power Farm. They work with horses. And his thing was like, look, am not built very strong. I don't have a lot of time. We do these 3 acres of vegetables just with my wife and I. I gotta find a way to not have to do any weeding. So they started reading books from back from the 30s. And they looked at the rotations that were practiced back then. And the principle of those rotations were that they were alternating having a summer bare fallow preceding the year that they grow a crop whereby the greatest competition of weeds with the crop was over the summer. So being able to combat weeds in the previous year allowed them to have less weed pressure the following year. In short, they were creating a neutral year. And this is what I've been doing for a long time right now. And that way I've been reducing the weed pressure on the farms that I've worked at. What does it look like? Well, first of all, we introduced rye, not just as a cover crop, but in a year or two, before it went to seed, we would cut it because we really wanted to have mulch. And on Roxbury Farm, we also had animals. We needed bedding for the animals, so we needed a lot of straw. So having a lot of rye on the farm was actually really advantageous. Then we would work that under the rye, and we would bare fallow it. Now, I've seen in the questionnaire that a lot of growers are working with, having a problem with perennial weeds. This is rotation that will also help you combating some of these perennial weeds, because in the summer months, that's when you uproot those perennial weeds. You can introduce also a crop of buckwheat. We've seen that buckwheat is very competitive with weeds, not only with annuals, but even with perennials. Then after the buckwheat, we work that under again before it goes to seed, and we bare fallow again. Again, it says after rainstorms, mostly because we want those annual weeds to germinate, allow them to germinate, and then flush them out. Follow with oats and peas. And then we follow them with a crop that is like a crop that is relatively, whereby in the summer months, talk about summer weeds here, they would have great competition for weeds like potatoes, winter squash, carrots. Now, if you are very concerned about tillage, which I am too, over time, I got more concerned about, I did this bare fallow thing, but I didn't really was able to raise the organic matter on the soil. And I was like, well, what am I going to do if I want to not bare fallow, but I want to, bring under a lot of organic matter? Then I have to work with shade and population. So the buckwheat is nice for shade and population, but if I do this particular rotation, whereby after the rye, I don't bare fallow, but I plant crotalaria, which is sun hemp, cowpeas, sorghum, and sunflower. And because they grow so fast, there is not a single weed underneath there. And they grow tall and a tremendous amount of biomass. And then, while in the beginning, the sunflowers and the sorghum provide a lot of shade. Later on, when they die off, you get the crotalaria shooting up in September. This is what it looks like in September. It's about 8 feet tall. A lot of nitrogen being fixed in that year as well. Then we mow it after the frost. And please do not mow it before the frost because you're going to kill your mower. There's so much biomass. So, but the freeze drying of the sorghum and the crotalaria will allow you to mow it. This is what it looks like before the winter. And then in the spring, you no-till drill oats and peas in there. Now, if you don't have access to a no-till drill, many counties, soil and water, they will have a no-till drill available for you for doing something like this. This is what we're doing right now. I no longer have a no-till drill, but I still do the rotation. And then the oats and peas grows very fast in the spring. And then under the oats and peas, all that trash from the crotalaria and sorghum is disappearing like snow under the sun. It's unbelievable that actually when it comes to the middle of June, when the peas are that tall, which is very succulent, very easy to work under, we follow that with broccoli and cauliflower. Other tools, now here comes the rye in again. This is garlic. Then we, now we also we clean straw or 3-year-old hay. Now why 3-year-old hay? Anyone?
Weed seeds, you know, you get out of the barn.
It's what?
To get it out of the barn.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one, you know, Mark.
Weed seeds.
I didn't hear that.
Weed seeds?
Yes, exactly. It's clean at that point. Well, it depends, of course, if you allow weeds to regenerate on top of that brown bale or whatever, but after a couple of years, the weeds have died. So, you know, same thing what you can do in soil, and Brian will talk about that later, how seed predation works. It can also work in hay. So if you use fresh hay, there's weed seeds in it, you're gonna just basically spreading weed seeds. So you can also use black plastic, we all know about that, I don't have to go too much into that. Again, nice thing about doing that in between the black plastic keeps your fruit clean. Again, if you have high nitrogen levels in the soil, you'll see the straw breaking down really fast and weed seed still coming through it. So a lot of the growers that are no longer using straw because they saw weed pressure within the straw, they're using right now wheat fabric. And they have usually very high population of weed seeds. Crystal, we'll talk about targeting later. And then another tool that we have right before is flame weeding as an organic farmer. You will use the pre-emergence, but this is our pre-emergent. We irrigate, we allow the weeds to germinate. This is for annuals, of course, right? It would not work against grasses, would not work against perennials, but for your summer annuals, this is a very effective way before you say plant carrots. Other tools, mechanical breeding. I've talked very little about it because I really think that all the other ones are way more important. Eric Gallant from University of Maine was talking about the many little hammers that people use. Well, there's many little hammers. This is just one hammer. This particular tool is that one caveat with that is make sure you have very nice seed beds. If your seed bed is rough, your weed control, mechanical cultivation is not going to work very well. So the more level you can make your seed bed, the more likely you will be able to use precision weed control. And Brian, again, will talk about that later. We either grow in raised beds or in ridges. And then here, when you talk about the mechanical weed control, I would say, and I don't know if you will talk about stacking, Brian? Yeah. All right. So the whole principle here is that you want to stack your tools. You want to make it in one pass. This is a finger weeder, and it usually followed after a mechanical hoe and some torsion weeders. So first you hit the ground with the goose feet, then the torsions. I don't know if people can see the torsions there. And then if you go back and then followed by finger weeders. And by having, you know, these three different actions, you can get 95% weed control. And then there's also precision weed control available for ridges. This is in carrots. And here you can see where in the carrots, and actually yields of carrots go up the deeper they root. So you're creating basically instead of 7 inches, you're having 11 inches of topsoil in the ridges, creating higher yield. And you are putting 2 or 3 rows of carrots on a ridge. Last one also is avoiding seed rain. While maybe they might not really be detrimental for your crop, when those last weeds pop up, your broccoli or winter squash, we do remove them because one plant can generate hundreds of thousands of seeds. So we call it seed rain. All right, in summary, so this is what I've learned from my colleagues growing field crops. They have better crop rotations, they use population and shape, and they have optimum fertility management. And then the other tools available are avoiding seed rain, mulching, tarping, flame weeding, and mechanical weed control. Thank you. Do I have time for questions? I think I did.
Yeah.
We're done.
Any questions? For the leaving straw, so we buy straw for bed, this is dairy farm, leaving that straw for 2 years.
I would assume so, yeah. So the question is if you can leave the straw for 3 years, if there are any weed seeds in the straw, they would die as well. I would assume so. Yes, Brian.
do keep the straw or the hay dry. I know sometimes I've tried to soak it, let it outside, let it soak, sprout all the seed, but then you get this moldy mess.
Yeah,
So, you know, there might be more weeds in the dry stuff, but maybe it's easier to work with.
yeah, I think with the straw, it will be detrimental if you could store it outside. The water soaks in much deeper than with hay. But with the hay, generally, it's like you are able to get older hay for at least an hour each for about $5 or $10 a bale. And it is like, you know, not really good feeding quality hay. And I just let it sit outside, and then if it's a 4x5 bale, the outer 6 inches, you know, becomes compost. You throw it away. But yeah, they're not soaked. But in our experience, they are clean. I think there's just enough moisture there to make those seeds die down. Because if not, I would not want to store my own seeds inside a bale. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, the intuitive part of it. Oh, one more question. The mix again. Oh, it's 60 pounds of crotalaria, 10 pounds of sorghum, 5 pounds of sunflower, and 20 pounds of cowpeas. I do what? Oh no, I don't. I don't like to broadcast seed ever. I really want to drill them, and so you need to calibrate your planter for that. So that's the total mix. So when you calibrate your drill, you want to make sure that the total amount, that whatever it adds up to 100 and something pounds, comes out of the drill as a mix. And I did not mention it, but we also have to inoculate the crotalaria because that is a particular inoculant that might not exist in your soil to get the greatest benefit.
I have a question.
Yes.
So the total area, do you worry about it going to seed?
No, it has never become a problem. I have never seen it actually go into seed because the season is too short. It's a tropical crop. One of the mistake we have made is using millet instead of sorghum. And the millet did go to seed. And then, but it did come up in the spring. And then we were able to terminate it again. Because the whole thing is, and I actually haven't really talked about that, but if you do have seed rain, do not work it under. The same thing with the millet. When the millet went to seed, you let it sit on the ground. You will see a lot of field mice eating it, and then in the spring it will germinate, and then you kill it. So if you ever have it happen that your crop gets out of control, do not work it under. That's the one cardinal rule. It might make you feel better. It looks clean. It's like you cleaned up your fields, but you actually created problems. All right, forward.
Thank you very much.